This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 94 of Here's How for the 22nd of October 2019. I wouldn't have thought that there was a shortage of small left-wing parties in Ireland, but now we have another one. Let's hear what their TD has to say for himself.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Here's what we've got coming up for you in this podcast.
Absolutely, but I don't think we should have politicians, for example, running our health service. I think we should have health professionals overwhelmingly running our health service.
We do. It's consultants. They run it, and they run it for their own benefit. That's exactly the situation we have. That's exactly the situation that we have now. That's coming up in a moment. But first I want to thank my Patreon donors who help make this show possible. I really appreciate them. For those of you who don't know, Patreon is a system that allows people to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month. And if you think that you could do the same as them, there's details on the website and at the end of the show. I ended up going way over time in this interview, but I think that it's all interesting and I'm not going to chop it up, so let's hear it. Paul Murphy was an MEP for the Socialist Party. Since then, he was elected in a by-election in 2014 and re-elected to the Dáil in 2016 for what became the Solidarity Party. But recently, he left that party and created Rise. Paul, congratulations on your new organisation. Also, congratulations on your website. Can you tell people what's the web address and what inspired it?
Yep. So our web address is www.letusrise.ie, which is obviously a reference to the infamous or famous Larkin quote, which actually Larkin took from the French Revolution, which is that the great appear great because we are on our knees, let us rise. On the left in Ireland, there are a lot of groups and people almost lose count. There's the Socialist Party, there's the Workers' Party, there's the Socialist Workers' Party. There, I think, was the Anti-Austerity Alliance. I think you were remaining part of the People Before Profit Alliance. You were also at one stage in the same party as some of the people in Independence for Change. You know the clip that I'm going to have to play for you, don't you? I probably do.
The only people we hate more than the Romans are the Judean People's Front.
And the Judean Popular People's Front.
Oh, yes.
Split. And the People's Front of Judea.
Yes.
What? The People's Front of Judea. Splitters.
We're the People's Front of Judea.
Oh. I thought we were the Popular Front.
People's Front.
Whatever happened to the Popular Front?
He's over there.
Joking aside, Paul, you'd have to agree, all of this splitting and this so many small groups on the left, that flies in the face of Larkin's vision of one big united movement on the left, doesn't it?
It's certainly not a good thing. And we don't advocate it for the left. We're not for it. We think it's a step backwards, in a sense, to have a more divided left. But we feel it was like a necessary step backward in order to take steps forward, in order to construct and play a role in constructing a broad party of the left that can become a mass party of ordinary working class people with
Paul, I've heard mass party. I have heard so many tiny organisations saying they all want to be the mass party. You can't all be the mass party, and history suggests that none of you can.
And I'm not suggesting to you that we're going to be the mass party or that we want to be the mass party. Of course, if a mass of people turned up and agreed with our ideas and wanted to join, we'd be delighted. But we don't think that's what's going to happen. It's for a very definite reason that we haven't proclaimed ourselves a political party. We describe ourselves as a group. We are modest about what we are, which is a distinct, clearly revolutionary socialist Marxist trend, which has drawn certain conclusions from our debate inside the Socialist Party, but which seeks to contribute to the building of a broader left organisation where we see ourselves as playing a role, but we don't think that Rise is going to become the new mass party of the left. And I think the fact that we don't have that conception, the fact that we think that the Socialist Party, Solidarity, the SWP, People Before Profit, and others, some of the people involved in Independence for Change, we see all of those as potentially playing a role and being part of a broad party of the left, as well as hopefully loads of new people who currently maybe don't think of themselves as socialists, who certainly aren't organised in any socialist organisation today.
Sure. Will you be running candidates as Rise?
No, so we're still part of Solidarity People Before Profit, right, which is the parliamentary alliance, left bloc in the Dáil. We are, like, formally, legally speaking, an accounting unit of Solidarity People Before Profit. So in effect, Solidarity People Before Profit has gone from being a two-legged animal to being a three-legged animal with Solidarity, People Before Profit and Rise. And the reason for that is because precisely we are modest about what we are, and because Solidarity, People Before Profit is the closest thing we have right now. It's quite a distance from the mass party of the left that we need, but it's unified cooperation of now three different forces on the left standing in a common banner for the elections.
Okay, but specifically in where you are running candidates, will you only do that where there is no candidate from those other legs of that organisation?
I would hope so. Obviously, we have to have a discussion on candidates and where we'll be standing candidates and everything else. But that would be our perspective. I mean, I think we almost definitely will stand me in Dublin Southwest as a Solidarity People Before Profit candidate. Whether or not there will be other Solidarity People Before Profit candidates, I don't know. And then we'll look at other areas where we can contribute to a serious, radical, anti-capitalist, socialist left challenge for the next general election. Something we raised when we launched was the idea that you have these 4 by-elections coming up, presuming that there isn't a general election, which may replace it. But 4 by-elections coming up at the end of November, we don't have any ambition to stand in any of those by-elections. But what would be good, and a minimal but important step towards the kind of broader left party that we need, would be if that the left could agree to have a common slate for those 4 by-elections, have one candidate from the serious, genuine left in each of those constituencies, and have some sort of common platform, some common agreement, some common assistance, etc. And if we could facilitate that into coming into being, that would be a contribution to building a broader non-sectarian left.
What was your point of disagreement with your old party that caused you to leave?
I mean, it was a debate that went on over the course of a year, and so there were many points in reality that came up, but I think the central point, both for us and for the Socialist Party, is about the relative weight to place on the building of a distinct socialist organisation like the Socialist Party or Rise relative to the building of broader movements, a broader environmental movement.
So basically how friendly you can be to the non-hard left, maybe to the Social Democrats, the Greens, or even Sinn Féin?
I mean, mostly focused in terms of movements. And again, I wouldn't caricature the Socialist Party as not being interested in building broader movements. The Socialist Party obviously has played an important role in building broader movements in the past, but us seeing it as being more important, and us seeing it as being actually the best way to build the kind of Marxist trend that we want to build by being part of those movements, for example, with Extinction Rebellion or whatever. And I think as a part of that, that does involve cooperation with many others who will not consider themselves socialists or our particular brand of socialists or whatever at this point in time. And I think when it comes to then organised political forces to our right, like the Social Democrats or Sinn Féin or whatever, I think we and the Socialist Party share ultimately a common assessment that what those parties stand for is not sufficient. It isn't. They stand for managing capitalism, and in this period of crisis of capitalism, that means ultimately implementing austerity and so on. But we felt that it wasn't sufficient to simply say that. Whenever there's very many very good people who look towards those parties, who hope those parties would bring about change and so on, and we think that means you have to be prepared to work in coalitions and alliances with these people on the things that you agree with, and allow people, therefore, to kind of test them out in practice as to whether they're capable of fighting for the kind of things that I think people, for example, who look to Sinn Féin, want to see a massive public housing building programme, want to see a breaking with the rules of the fiscal treaty and so on.
Okay. I want to look then, and I've been going through your website, so I want to look at some of the policies that you've stated, and one of them jumped out at me, and I pretty much jumped with joy because you had a very clear headline which said, ditch the Help to Buy scheme. I just think this is absolutely correct. This is essentially giving people more money in their pocket to buy a fixed amount of houses. And you would have thought that, given the characters in government, that they'd have learnt from people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan that there's a basic market mechanism, that if you put more money into a market to chase a fixed amount of resources, that what you're doing is you're using taxpayers' money to buy inflation. That's money that's just going straight to developers and landowners, isn't it?
It is.
Maybe not straight, but indirectly.
Exactly, indirectly.
But
it's going
straight
through the hands
to them.
of first-time buyers, then into the pockets of developers. That is definitely what's happening with it. And I think it was an under-commented upon feature of the budget that was extended. And it was extended at the behest of the Construction Industry Federation, who represent the developers and the builders, after multiple lobbying attempts by them. And it was originally introduced on behalf of the CIF. And, let's be clear, the CIF is a lobbying organization on behalf of the developers. They're not an organization representing first-time buyers. They're not doing it because they think it's in the interest of first-time buyers. They're doing it because they think it's in their material interest to increase their profits, and that's what it does. And the evidence, for example, there's a similar scheme in Britain, and again, there's plenty of evidence that the impact is to inflate house prices or keep them inflated, not to make it ultimately any easier to buy for first-time buyers. But that ultimately is the logic of the government. The government thinks by keeping prices high and profits high that ultimately they'll resolve the supply side problem by incentivizing more developers in and so on. And it's just, it's a very, the government will make a big deal of being pragmatic, and they're not ideological. It's us on the left who are ideological. But it's a very ideological response to the crisis, when the much more obvious thing is to take the money that you're allocating to this and instead use it to actually build homes, because that's what we need. We need more homes built, and we need to add to the number of houses that exist in this country.
I actually happen to, I don't agree with you on everything, as you may hear, but I actually agree with you 100% on that. And I think that it's interesting that you, perhaps not alone, but certainly are in a small group that have recognized what the market mechanism is doing there, which suggests to me that you believe there exists a market mechanism. And I just looked at another policy that you put on your website, which was free public transport. You want free, green, frequent public transport, accessible to all communities with quality pay and conditions for workers. Why should public transport be free?
Because we think it should be a basic public service, provided free at the point of use. Like our health service is supposed to be, like our education service is supposed to be. But
what are you trying to achieve? What's the sure, that's what the way you want to do it, but what is the thing that you want to do?
The predominant thing we want to do is to drastically reduce carbon emissions from transport. Transport is our second, energy and transport are second and third, very close together, but our second biggest emitting sector in the economy. Mm-hmm. A big reason for that is a huge number of individual car journeys, often individual car journeys which have one person in them. It isn't overwhelmingly because people are selfish or people want to spend half of their lives sitting in cars, but it's because transport is not it doesn't appear very viable for them.
Okay.
And so
I want you to pause, because I think you've made a huge mistake on that. Because number one, of all of the people who drive, the overwhelming majority of them choose to pay more than they would need to pay, because they're willing to pay for extra convenience or extra comfort and prestige, really. So people who drive a Ferrari, if they wanted to, could trade down to a Jaguar without any real difficulty. It wouldn't mean that they couldn't commute, but they'd save a lot of money. People who drive a Jaguar could trade down to a Mercedes. People who drive a Mercedes could trade down to a Toyota Corolla or whatever. But they all choose to spend way more money than they need to for that prestige and comfort. Isn't that telling us that it's not cost that is driving people away from public transport and into their cars?
I think it is not only costs.
No, it's not cost at all, because those people, sure, there are some people who live in places that are inaccessible to public transport, or there might be a bus at a time that suits them in the morning, but they know that they're not sure that there'll be a bus back in the evening, and that doesn't work. But there are huge numbers of people who could use public transport, but choose not to, even though with the prices of public transport as it is, it would save them a huge chunk of money, because they don't want to save that money because they like the comfort and the prestige. And wouldn't it be a better thing if you have a lump of money to put into public transport, rather than making public transport free? Wouldn't it be better to use that money to invest in public transport to make it really high quality and really frequent, so that, and it kind of worked a little bit with the Luas, that people, if you say you get the Luas to work in some offices, that's okay. If you say you get the bus to work, people look down their nose at you. Wouldn't it be better to make public transport better rather than make it free?
I think we should do both.
Yeah, but if you have a fixed amount of money, shouldn't all of that money go towards improving it? Because it's already the cheapest option, unless you're thinking of cycling or walking.
Well, I think we have an example of, to some degree, this was tested. It wasn't actually made free, but in Cork, as far as I remember, it was reduced to €1 for a specified period of time. I think a month or something like that. And I'm just trying to look for it here. But the usage of public transport increased significantly.
Yes, because it displaced walkers and cyclists onto the bus, because now they didn't have to bother. It doesn't displace drivers.
I think we need a massive kind of behavior shift in people and how people conceive of how they're going to get from A to B, A being presumably home, B being work, and back again. And I think we need to do radical things that make people rethink the choices that they've previously been making and make them open to do it. Because obviously inertia is a big factor in why people do what they do. They're used to it. That's how they travel to work or whatever. So I think definitely, and if you have to choose one or the other, I agree with you that frequency and accessibility of public transport would ultimately have more of an impact on public transport use than the price.
No. No, Paul, that's not correct. It's not a choice between one or the other. Both of them are essentially bottomless pits, and it's how much of your money you want to pour into one or the other. And you will never fill up either of those pits, but you can fill one or other of them quite a way. And in every case, it would achieve the goal better if you improve the quality rather than if you reduce the price, because the price compared to driving is already very low.
But I think if you have free public transport, it will change how people think about it. And so I think the difference between, let's say, reducing an average bus fare from €2 to €1 compared to reducing it from €1 to €0 is qualitatively different, even though you're talking about the same amount.
Yes, I agree with that. There's actually been studies which support you on that. That people tend to value things that are cheaper less, but when they're free, it breaks you out of that domain. But I want to move on to a couple of other topics that you had. One of them, and it was really key in your election when you were first elected to the Dáil in 2014, was water charges. Are you still advocating free water, unlimited for everybody?
We're still opposed to the commodification of water, and so any charge on the usage of water, yes.
Any charge?
Any charge on the usage of water.
Michael McDowell, somebody who we both might have words with, but he said something that I thought was very perceptive. He said, if electricity was free, you'd leave the lights on all night.
I'm not sure you would. I don't.
You know what, Paul? I did the research, and you would. And let me tell you the headline from the research. Of all of the water domestic supply we're talking about here, of all of the domestic supply of water here, less than 1% of users use a quarter of the total supply. And the second centile, so the people who are in the 98th centile, they use a gigantic amount as well. So if you put those two centiles together, you've got more than a third of the total supply. That clear, and in the 1 year when water was effectively being paid for by a large number of people, there was a massive drop in the consumption by those top two centiles.
So a few things. One is, we obviously currently have a situation whereby it's the equivalent of the electricity being free in terms of water. And the evidence is there that people don't do the equivalent of leave the lights on all night.
No, there isn't. No. I've got the evidence. I contacted the CSO. I got the consumption broken down by centile, and there is enormous amount of evidence that a lot of people do the equivalent of leaving the lights on all night.
But see, that doesn't make any sense, because then how come we use a fair bit less water, I think about 15% less water per person than in Britain, whereby they have water charges, or where water is not free. You can't leave your lights on all night.
There's a whole range of confounding factors there. But what we do know is that working class areas use considerably less than middle class areas, and that presumably mostly in middle class areas, those top two centiles use more than a third of the total supply.
So the top people, the top two centiles, let's say, who are using water, they are overwhelmingly not people who are, putting on the tap to do their teeth and then leaving it on until the next time they leave water. They're people who have leaks. And the leaks need to be fixed.
No, not true. That's also not true. I've checked that out as well. For the top centile, it's more than 6,000 litres a day. Anybody who had 6,000 litres a day leaking into their foundations for 365 days a year, their house would fall down. It's not leaks.
There's no way that people are actually using 6,000 litres in a day. Like, that's Irish Water claims.
More than 1%. No, sorry, that's the readings from the meters. More than 1% of Irish, of metered domestic users use more than 6,000 litres a day.
They have leaks. They definitely have leaks, and that's Irish Water.
They may have a leak as well, but that couldn't explain 6,000 litres a day.
But let's go back to your
6,000 litres a day. By the way, just so that people have an understanding of that. That's one of those Lidl swimming pools that were being marketed a summer or two ago. That's one of those every day.
See, those people have leaks, in my opinion, and so then you need to go back to your situation whereby you have a specified amount of money.
But okay, Paul. Okay, no, Paul. That doesn't. No. The leaks argument doesn't work. Also, because when those people were charged for that water, they reduced their consumption by an enormous amount, by something like 30%.
If you charge someone and they have a leak, there's nothing they can do to stop having that leak.
But they did. They reduced their consumption when they were charged.
So let's have the rational choice that you pose to me in terms of investing in free or frequent public transport. That same choice applies as to whether we should establish an expensive metering and checking of metering system, which a full rollout is like 500 million in terms of the capital expenditure on meters, and then there's a certain ongoing cost of checking and so on. Should we invest in that, or should we invest in actually fixing the leaks? And I think it's very clear that we should invest in fixing the leaks in the main system, but also then in people's individual homes. And that's, in my opinion, if the government was serious and Irish Water were serious about actually dealing with leaks, and that's what this is about, this is what they would do, as opposed to, in my opinion, it is about making water a commodity, which therefore changes how it's viewed and so on, but also opens the door at a later stage, and it may be a relatively later stage because of the struggles that are being made here.
You're right. It changes, Paul, you're right. It changes how it's viewed, and it means somebody, in the house says, don't leave the bloody light on. You're absolutely right. Charging for it changes how it's viewed, and people view it as a resource that should be conserved, and that's what they should be doing.
But I think people value many things that they don't pay for at the point of use. People value health, people value education, and I'm in favor of decommodifying lots of things. So I'm in favor of decommodifying public transport. I'm in favor of keeping water non-commodified. I'm in favor of moving to decommodify housing. I think the more services that we can take out of a commodified sector into a decommodified sector, the better. And I think people will value those things. I don't think that they won't, just by virtue of the fact that it doesn't have a price tag at the point of use. And obviously, I think it's more equitable that we pay for these things through progressive taxation as opposed to the kind of indirect taxation which relates to water charges.
Okay. I want to pause that one and move on to a different topic. I know that you've not been a member of a local authority, but you do have some representation. And I saw just in particular where your party and your allied parties are relatively strong, Dublin City Council, your people voted to reduce the local property tax. Mm-hmm. Are you sure that was a good idea?
Yes. I mean, I think it's a very similar argument to the argument we just had. Property tax.
But are you the PDs or are you socialists?
It's not. We're radical, revolutionary socialists, which doesn't mean taxing people's family home. That is not a progressive tax. It's a tax which relates to the value of people's homes. Obviously, the value of people's homes has some relationship to their wealth, but
it's pretty close.
I mean, you have a lot of exceptions, and the point is, like for most people,
and also where you don't have an incentive, where you have perhaps somebody, an older couple or a widow or whatever, who are occupying an enormous house that they had raised a family in some years before, giving them a bit of a nudge to say maybe you want to trade down.
But I think an important thing is that this isn't wealth for most people. It's a home that they live in, that they pay a mortgage on, or whatever, and it's an extra indirect source of taxation. It's part of a larger kind of strategy of moving away from direct taxation towards indirect taxation. It's part of, they remove the funding that comes from the central government to the councils in order to be replaced by this sort of indirect property tax funding.
Okay, so I want to just look at the figures on that, and I'm just going to play a very short clip from Councillor Michael Pidgeon. He's one of the new wave of Green Party councillors who was elected, I think, Dublin's southwest inner city. But just listen to the figures he gives.
So if you're living in a local authority house, you get absolutely nothing from this. If you're in another kind of social housing, you either get nothing or you get €14 a year from this tax cut. €14. If you're renting, like I am, you get absolutely nothing. If you're homeless, you get absolutely nothing apart from worse services. If you're in the average one-bed apartment in the city, congratulations, you've saved €34 a year. Worth considering who you're actually giving sizable tax cuts to. Dermot Desmond's house in Dublin 4 was worth $14 million in 2013 when this was valued. To cut his rate, you're giving him €5,100 this year. Other people in that part of town, if they've got a house that's worth €2 million, you're giving them €1,000 this year in a tax cut. The point here is that you're giving pittances to people who own the average house in this city, while giving away thousands to millionaires and the rich.
He's right, isn't he?
I don't think the tax should exist at all, and therefore it's wrong to present it as, a tax cut which is disproportionately benefiting these people. And it also would be wrong to look at our opposition to the property tax in isolation from the other policies we're for. I mean, we're for an actual wealth tax, actually tax Dermot Desmond's wealth. Never mind
the only real wealth you can catch is property.
Well, you can catch financial wealth that people have, financial assets that people have. Such as you can tax them on the shares that they own.
Not if they're not. That just shifts them out of the country.
Well, so you're saying the only tax any
wealth that can be emailed is going to be very, very difficult to tax.
But I think we should have.
No, that's true, isn't it? That's true, Paul. That's true. Any wealth that can be emailed, but all of that wealth ultimately represents bricks and mortar or something real. So the thing to do is to tax that real thing. And you can hear from, I don't think you disagree with those figures given by that councillor. You're given zero to renters. You're giving, maybe a Mars bar a month to the average person, and you're giving thousands and thousands to millionaires.
But we're in favour then of having a millionaire's tax, which taxes the net wealth of millionaires in excess of €1 million. And I think if you're faced with that situation of, capital flooding out of the country in order for these people to avoid paying tax, well, then I think we need to have capital controls to prevent that taking place. And let's go after
capital controls.
Wait,
Paul. Capital controls means effectively closing down every multinational operating in Ireland.
I don't agree with that. I don't.
Hold on. Apple are going to stay in Ireland. Intel, Facebook, they're going to stay in Ireland if they're not allowed to take their money out. It also means leaving the EU.
Fundamentally, the model of the Irish economy of relying on foreign direct investment from your Apples and your Googles and your Facebooks is not sustainable.
But that's a different argument. Capital control is a connected argument. It's a connected argument, but it's separate. Capital controls means leaving the EU and Facebook, Google, Microsoft, the works, leaving Ireland. Now, you can argue that might be a good thing, but that's the truth.
I think a left-wing government would have no choice but to impose capital controls. I think it was if you look at the Syriza experience, which is obviously a disastrous experience from our point of view and a betrayal by Syriza,
this is the Greek
it
party.
proves the point that you begin to implement socialist left-wing policies, and these people will try and take their money out of the country. That's the truth. But we have to reject that, therefore, we just have to watch their money leave, or we therefore can't implement any policies that threaten the interests of corporations or threaten the very wealthy, because that's the reason that corporation tax rates across the world, certainly effective corporation tax, have been plunging for 30 years at this point.
But there is a way around that, which is to tax the ultimate wealth, because anything, in shares or whatever, they ultimately represent a wealth. They're just the representations of the wealth. And Ireland is almost unique in the world, certainly in the Western world, in the way that it focuses almost all of our taxation on economic activity. That's to say, taxing profits of companies and mostly taxing people's wages. And we have almost none of our taxation on land, on assets, on economic inactivity. So you can have very wealthy people who inherit property tax-free and who never pay a cent on that, of tax on that, but they consume services just like anybody else, and they can end up effectively paying less tax. The only tax that they end up paying is VAT when they actually buy something. And that is fundamentally unbalancing our problem. That what I would have, what makes me mad is that left-wing politicians like yourself won't stand up and say Ireland should tax land and property. Because
I'm taxing land and property.
No, hold on for a second. That means you have to tax it all. Because if you put in a threshold, it's very easy just to divide it in two, and then you're underneath the threshold and you get away with it. The bottom line is that, ordinary people are going to have to pay some tax. That's just fantasy to say that only the rich will pay tax. Ordinary people in any economy will have to pay some tax. The fact that all of that tax is on their income and none of it is on, for example, their assets, their house or whatever, unbalances our economy. And that's what led to the property boom, because people, if you tax white bread and you don't tax brown bread, then you can expect people to buy more brown bread and less white bread. If you tax working and you don't tax property speculation, or even just putting more money into your own house, then that's where the talent and the effort will go. That's true, isn't it?
But, okay, let's say we have a tax on assets, which includes land, includes property, etc. Yep. And let's say we do have a level below which it's not taxed. And let's say that level is €1 million. And that means that Dermot Desmond's property worth, I think the councillor said it was 5 million or something. That means that we get to tax 4 million of his 5 million worth of house. And it also means that we don't hit ordinary people who are living in a family home, who have low incomes, who are struggling to get by, etc.
Okay, hold on for a second. Most ordinary people pay tax. There is, sure. I'm not advocating that they pay more tax. What I'm advocating is that it should be rebalanced so that more of that tax is on their assets and less of it is on their income.
I think, though, as a general rule, it is more fair and more progressive to have the main base of tax based on income, because that's something that people are getting on a yearly basis that they're able to spend, et cetera, rather than something that they...
Paul, that's policy. That's a Fianna Fáil policy that led us directly to the crash.
No. I think what led us to the crash...
Okay, I'll pause that because I don't want to harp too long on anything. Okay. One other line from your thing says, use the Apple tax and the hoarded wealth. This is the 13 billion euro disputed Apple tax payment that's being held in escrow at the moment. Use the Apple tax and the hoarded wealth of the rich to fund quality public services and a socialist green transformation of the economy. Paul, what you're saying is that we should use capital receipts to fund current payment. That's exactly what brought the crash.
That's not what we're saying.
That's what that sentence says.
Well, the socialist green transformation of society, what that's about, and maybe that's, to be honest, that's what it should say the money is for.
Well, it says to fund quality public services.
Mm-hmm. So I don't think it should be used to fund public services. I think it should be used to transform the nature of the economy and to create a sustainable industrial base in this economy with a large sector of it being publicly owned. So I think the kind of things that, if we got our hands on the 13 billion that we should be using it for is like massive investment in renewable energy, a significant investment in other green jobs like a retrofitting program. I think and it's also investment in research and development, in state funded research and development, to try and use the possibility of getting all this money to fund a sustainable shift away from this model of being reliant on the Apples, the Googles, etc., which, even if you kind of ideologically don't have a problem with it, is not going to stay here forever, is under threat in terms of Brexit, in terms of Trump, etc. Mm-hmm. So we need an alternative. So I think we should use that money for capital expenditure, not for current expenditure.
So you're accepting my point, it should not be used for current expenditure?
Yeah, I agree that 13 billion should not be used for...
Okay. One other thing that I've got on here. Democratize the internet. Okay. Democratize the global economy. Okay. Bring the major internet companies and all other multinationals under international democratic control. Are we going to be nationalizing Google? Will we have Minister Regina Doherty making decisions on what we should be doing on the internet?
See, I think that question illustrates the problem that we have and why it's posed in those terms. Because these companies are multinational. They span multiple countries. In fact, your Google, your Facebook, have an impact on probably every country in the world.
And in fairness, that's part of their strength. That's one of the reasons why they have been so successful.
Yes. And so therefore, any one country, or certainly a very small, relatively weak country in terms of the world economy like Ireland, attempting to nationalize Google or Facebook is unlikely to be successful, which is why, in our opinion, the struggle for a different sort of society has to be an international struggle, and the nationalization and public ownership of these companies and the running of them as public utilities would have to happen on a multinational basis.
So means, instead of Regina Doherty being in charge of the internet, we'd have Pádraig Flynn in charge of the internet.
Certainly not Pádraig Flynn.
No, but people. This is a type of person who ends up running international institutions.
But you see that's on the basis of the current system that we have, the current kind of model of democracy that we have. We think the workers,
which is people who get votes, get elected.
People who get votes in elections that are dominated by money, in elections that without any recall, where you have very little ownership and control of ordinary people of the democratic process, and a big alienation from it.
Okay. I take your point on that. But one that I've seen here, and really this one was the one that got me. Nationalize the banking system? Okay, maybe. And the core sectors of the economy currently controlled by major corporations, including construction? Not so sure. Natural resources? Different story. Big retail chains? Are you seriously going to be nationalizing Lidl, Aldi, Tesco?
Yes.
Have you any idea how insane that is, Paul?
Why? Because you think big retailers by some definition, have to be run on a private for-profit basis. I mean,
well, profit is one thing, but private, yes. Let me explain why. Because the world is enormously more complex than it was even at the start of our lifetimes. It is extremely complex, and experience shows that no one organization, be it a government or anything else, can manage the degree of complexity that exists in the economy, and you need to have separate organizations. And if you look at in the competitive economy, where, for example, in the past decades, Lidl and Aldi have entered the market, they have provided much more choice and had a serious downward pressure on prices. But if you compare the government's record on this, the Dáil sweet shop was built in 2008. They spent 1.3 million euro building a sweet shop. It went more than 60% over budget, and it couldn't break even. They closed it after 6 years. But bear in mind that a sweet shop like that takes newspapers, okay, hard to get that wrong, and Mars bars and whatever, products that have very long shelf lives. Lidl and Aldi are incredibly complex organizations that have very, very delicate, complex supply chains. That means that they get fresh food into the consumer's basket in very short order. They are very experienced at getting exactly the right amount of produce in exactly the right place. And experience shows that governments who have many other balls to keep in the air just can't do that.
So we're not suggesting that, an equivalent cabinet to the current kind of cabinet that we have would have, a minister who's responsible for Lidl and Aldi or whatever and would manage the running of those things. What currently happens, let's take Lidl or Aldi or whatever, those organizations internally plan. They plan with the assistance of a market mechanism, no question. But they have plans. The supply chains that they have, they don't arrive out of nowhere. Someone picks up a phone and contacts someone else and arranges to buy X amount of product for Y price, and so on.
So that's most certainly not. That's absolutely not the way it happens.
They are internally planned organizations. There's a book by Lee Phillips. Go on.
Yeah, yes, but no, it is vastly more complex than that, and it includes very, very sophisticated modelling of how much of what is needed where.
Yes, absolutely. But that's all planning. And so there's no reason that planning. So the book I was going to mention is a book called The People's Republic of Walmart by Lee Phillips, which is about how internally inside Walmart, they precisely have, these extensive planning mechanisms, which are also informed by, you don't have it in Lidl or Aldi, but in Tesco's or Dunnes or whatever, you have your loyalty card where they are tracking your purchases, and they can predict, there's going to be a surge in interest for X, Y, or Z because of where which is very interesting. And it shows how it's not just market mechanisms that inform what they need, but also, other ways of getting information. So these are internally planned organizations, but are obviously run on the basis of profit as opposed to in the interest of public need. And there, in my opinion, that there's no reason why that same process can't be done on a democratic basis, which means
by which you mean a socialist basis.
Yes, but which doesn't mean the government planning what Lidl or Aldi gets up to. It means the workers in Lidl and Aldi combined with the consumers of Lidl and Aldi having an input into this, that, or the other, but then an internal planning process. And then that the final, rather than money being sucked out of, like a circle in a sense, by profit or by unnecessary advertising, which is a certain wastage that happens on the basis of capitalism, where Lidl and Aldi will both advertise to you, despite the fact that, it's effectively the same. I think most people would feel they're effectively the same. Rather than wasting money on profit and wasting money on advertising, that money can be used for the benefit of society as a whole.
Okay,
that's
Paul,
the argument.
You can't see a reason why that can't be done on a socialist basis. And it may well be true that we don't know what that reason is. But for sure as hell that reason exists. I guess maybe you've been to Cuba? I have. Well, I have. And you know what I got in Cuba?
What'd you get?
I got in Cuba thin. That's what I got. It is appalling. The quality of the food in a tropical country that has very low population density, so there should be no problem growing every possible crop under the sun. And it is appalling, the quality of the food. It is shockingly bad. And many days when I saw what was on offer, I just skipped. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that regardless of whether you can say there's no reason for this or there's no reason for that, experience proves that the market mechanism puts food on people's plates in a way that has never been matched in any socialist country or any country with central planning.
But why doesn't capitalism put food on people's plates then in Haiti or the Dominican Republic or other countries that are equivalent to Cuba, where the poverty rates are much higher?
I don't deny those problems at all, but let me suggest why. Let me suggest why. No, absolutely. I agree that is a limited analysis. But let me suggest why that's not happening in Haiti and many other tragically poor countries around the world. And it is effectively corruption, because the wrong people are getting the wrong incentives and the wrong rewards. And if your job depends on putting dinner on people's plates, then you'll do that. But in those countries, you tend to have very high degree of control, either by mafias or by actually the government. And when you have a minister for supermarkets, they're not only motivated by putting dinner on people's plates, they're also motivated by lobbying, by the excessive power of other stakeholders, essentially. And the big companies, very powerful companies like Lidl and Aldi in particular, are good at resisting that.
But that kind of presumes that the profit mechanism and the incentive for profit, which is ultimately what these corporations, legally that's what they're set up to do, is to maximize profit for their shareholders, that coincides with the meeting of a public need of the provision of food or whatever. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that can be the case, but often it's not the case. Take, you might see this as an extreme example, but take the fossil fuel industry. Yeah. Their pursuit, or take the tobacco industry, their pursuit of profit is not in the interest. We don't benefit from that as a society. As a society, we lose out because they treat the damage to our environment and ultimately our health as an externality to their company. They don't have to pay for it, so they don't care about it.
Totally agree.
You can try and come up with various mechanisms to internalize those externalities, yes. But I think you'll find, and obviously they are, they're very good examples from our point of view because they're very obvious about where the problem.
Take that as an example. Take that, and smoking, you gave one. But the reality is that what has happened largely in the West, and Ireland has been pretty good on this, is that you started off with very powerful big tobacco interests, and they have been progressively slapped down. We see a very sharp reduction in the amount of smoking. We see the smoking ban that's been in place for like 20 years or something at this stage. In the type of system that you want to establish, it doesn't always happen, but it can frequently happen that, for example, the tobacco farmers end up being a powerful lobby, and they can stymie those type of reforms. The people who are, and in fact we see it in the EU, we have a government in Ireland where there's basically no competition in the farming sector, and politicians are there saying that our goal is to make beef more expensive in order to put more money in the pockets of the farmers who we're looking for votes from.
And within that,
and your system would be that on steroids.
But so you accept, therefore, that with this capitalist model that we have, you do already have, substantial lobbying interests, substantial vested interests, which, in my opinion, the big ones are the same big business interests, which control the core of the economy and are enormously powerful. And so you take the example of agriculture. There, I think, yes, there is a question of votes and so on. But I think above all, it's the big agribusiness corporations, your Greencore.
I'm not disputing that. I'm not disputing that, but I'm just saying that experience shows that the market has dealt with them not perfectly, but better when we look at, for example, a doll sweet shop costing millions and losing huge amounts of money in the simplest business possible, and you want to say, okay, this is the model that we should make our food supply reliant on.
But the doll sweet shop is not our model, and that's where the idea of like democratic public ownership, as opposed to public ownership with semi-state quangos and so on, as they would have ran Aer Lingus in the past or whatever. There are real problems with those, but the idea of actual participatory democracy, which involves those who are involved in both the kind of on the front line aspect of these industries, those involved in the more planning management aspect of these industries, and involves the consumers and wider community, etc., involved in the management organization being recallable to, again, those various groups of people, I think is a different model, which can avoid, your doll sweet shop kind of example.
Okay, no, but that doll sweet shop, that happens for a reason. It's because voters don't have that level of detail. You can't vote on the basis of the doll sweet shop. There's just too many things. You can only ask the voters for a certain amount of detail in their understanding. And the same is true of politicians.
But that's also about...
Nobody's good at everything. And if you have politicians running too many things, they do them all badly. It's not because they're politicians. It's because anybody running too many things does it badly.
Absolutely. But I don't think we should have politicians, for example, running our health service. I think we should have health professionals overwhelmingly running our health service.
We do. It's consultants. They run it, and they run it for their own benefit. That's exactly the situation we have. That's exactly the situation that we have now.
No, but...
The health service is being run. The health service is being run by health service workers, and they're running it to suit themselves. If you want an appointment, they tell 20 people to arrive for their appointment at 9 o'clock in the morning, and everybody sits in the waiting room starting at 9 o'clock in the morning until it suits them to see you.
But that's the point: is that they're not accountable to all of the people in the health service. Which is all the different grades of people involved in the health service.
But it's being run it is called producer capture. But Paul, we've gone way over time. I really appreciate you talking to me. And I think we've had an interesting discussion. Paul Murphy, Rise TD, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Never miss a show. Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there, please like the show on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Paul Murphy at PaulMurphy_TD, and get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Thanks again to all my patrons on Patreon. I appreciate them all. It allows me to devote more time to research and finding interesting guests. And if you could do the same as them and donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, go to patreon.com/Here's How. That link is on my website, and you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free there as well, on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.